Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ASB Armenian Studies Program lecture series for the month of February. Before introducing our guest, I'd like to also mention that we have one extra lecture next week on Wednesday, February 19th. Aisha Parla, who is an associate professor of anthropology at Sabancı University, is going to be speaking not here, which is our usual place of lectures, but in the history department, 1014 Tisch Hall, and she will be speaking on Armenian migrant children in Turkey, access to education and state of exception in a post-genocidal society. I'd like to thank Meneli Talinyan, who's actually arranged for her to come here, and we'll be introducing her next week. Vahe Tashian is a historian who earned his PhD at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. His research covers the period of the French occupation of Silesia, Syria, and Lebanon between World War I and World War II. More generally, the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire is his subject of study, the refugee problem in the Middle East, and the Kurdish-Armenian relations. Vahe Tashian is currently the project director and chief editor of a fascinating website, www.hushamadian.org, when Hushamadian can be translated as memory book, which was created in 2011 by the Berlin-based Hushamadian not-for-profit association. The website has a rich archive of sources that it has amassed together and is continuing to grow to be able to reconstruct the daily life of Ottoman Armenians and their social and cultural context. A variety of materials from photos to memoirs to ritual accounts of marriages and baptism, songs, recipes, and craft work are assembled to animate the lives of Armenian Ottomans in Harput, Palu, and Marash regions, to imagine how they lived with their neighbors and what the texture of everyday village life looked like. From memory book in cyberspace, this project has moved to paper with the publication of the first volume, fresh out of the press, or soon to be, at least we have it in hand, entitled Ottoman Armenians, Life, Culture, and Society, and our very own Zovinar Derderian has an article published in this volume. Tashian's publications are numerous, mostly in French, La France en Silésie et en Haute Mésopotamie, en conflit de la Turquie, de la Syrie et de l'Irak, France and Silesia, in the upper Mesopotamian areas, in the frontiers of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. He has some edited volumes as well. And in English, he has a volume, The Armenian General Benevolent Union, 100 Years of History, that's appeared in a two-volume work. His new book, based on the diaries of two Armenian deportees in 1915 and 1918 from Aintab, is currently in preparation for publication. He will be speaking about the memory making of these two men, Grigor Bogharian and Dernerses Tavukshian, from Aintab today. Please join me in welcoming Vahe Tashian.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the invitation. So, my paper is based on, like Catherine said, on a forthcoming book, which tells the story of two Armenian families from Aintab. In 1915, two Armenian families, the Bogharians and the Tavukshians, were deported from Aintab, so in the Ottoman Empire, together with many other Armenian inhabitants of the town. And they were forcibly resettled first in Hama and then in the nearby town of Salamiya, so nowadays or today in Syria. And two diaries written by members of these families have come down to us. One by Father Nerses Tavukcian, the other by Krikor Bogharian. And setting out from these diaries, my study recreates the quotidian world of deportees, ordinary lives caught in an extraordinary historical moment. The two diaries have never been systematically studied, and they constitute a unique source that allow us to humanize and personalize the experience of genocide. While Bogharian's and Tavukcian diaries were published in unedited form in the Armenian language in Beirut, the first one in 1973 and the other one in 1991, my study is based on the original manuscripts and other primary sources, which made apparent major discrepancies between them and the published version. Thus, my study supplements the diaries with letters, notes, or articles that shed further light on the deportees' lives. The study is a microhistory, the general context of which is the Armenian genocide. The two men's diaries allow us to comprehend to the level of day-to-day existence and expose minute and yet essential details. Tavukcian's and Bogharian's daily jottings show us how families struggle to survive day by day. They illustrate the gradual impoverishment that deprived a family of basic nourishment, as well as the mutual assistance relatives gave each other, but also the limits of such assistance. The two diaries recount the deaths of loved ones and the coerced religious conversions or other moral compromises to which people resorted in order to survive. In their daily jottings, in sum, the diaries whom I study depict a process, the gradual deterioration of day-to-day existence, whose outcome they cannot foresee, although they are painfully aware that they are living through a human catastrophe, that death is pitilessly mowing down their loved ones, and that they themselves are helpless in the face of it all. The diaries also show how they sustained themselves during these trying times through their faith or through reading, translating, familial solidarity, etc. Today, in my presentation, I will not talk about the situation during the war years, during the massacres and deportation period. Instead, I will emphasize on the situation in the aftermath of the war and genocide. And these issues are dealt in the last chapter of my forthcoming book. So, ceasefire, liberation of the deportees, a new chapter was opening in the history of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. We shall here recount an episode that will help us understand the significance of the moment. There were very many like these episodes in the period immediately following the catastrophe. It has to do with a debate that raged in the Armenian press in Istanbul, Izmir, Aleppo, Adana, and elsewhere. The debate was touched off by a speech by Artin Efendi Boshkezenian, a former member of the Committee for Union and Progress, or the Ittihad Party, and a representative from Aleppo in the Ottoman parliament. Boshkezenian happened to be a native of Aintab and continued to serve in the Ottoman parliament in the fateful years of the war. His name is mentioned both in Bogharian and the Nerses Tavukcian diaries. Both of them knew him. We have chosen to focus on this example from among many similar episodes because Boshkezenian was a friend of our two diaries. What did Artin Efendi declare in his speech? Taking the floor of the parliament on 5th November or 18 November with the new calendar, 1918, he said, quote, "The Turkish nation today stands accused before the civilized world. Today, there is an enormous crime which stands as the most sorrowful and bloody page of Ottoman history. The immense crime which has shaken both heaven and earth is known as the massacre of the Armenians, the Armenian calamity," unquote. The deputy from Aleppo went on to describe the perpetrators of this mass crime. And he said, "For this reason, the Turkish nation is accused, but the real perpetrator is not the Turkish nation, but the former Turkish government and administration. The nation is one thing, the government is another. I say that this great crime, of which an entire nation stands accused, was carried out by the former regime, or more correctly, by the hooligan regime. That government was the most appalling link in the chain of the crime that has been hung around the Turks' necks, namely responsibility for the Armenian tragedy. That crime was the work of a special organization made up of a handful of evildoers in the capital and the state officials at their orders in the provinces, namely valis, mutasarrifs, kaymakams, and commanders in the gendarmerie. Unquote. Boshkezenian next evoked the Turks who had opposed the government decision to massacre the Armenians, insisting in this perspective on the same idea. Quote, "It is not right to accuse an entire nation for the crimes of a handful of murderers and madmen." Unquote. Yet, Artin Efendi also pointed out that in a number of places, the common people too had taken part in the crime. And he said, "Those responsible for this evil are the kind of people who are incapable of weighing up the consequences of their acts. If sheep fall into a swamp, who is to blame? The sheep, the bellwether who led them into it, or the shepherd who took them from the fold? I say that while some among the multitude may have had a hand in the crime, the real culprits were their leaders, the state officials. Gentlemen, fanatical feelings are to be found in the depths of the multitude's heart, even in the most civilized of countries. It slumbers there and only rarely awakens. If some factor or the other does not intervene to rouse that fanatical feeling, it continues to slumber. Sometimes, however, vile, dishonorable men appear and arouse that savage emotion, and then it comes to life, turmoil and confusion break out everywhere. People then butcher each other, and civil chaos, banditry, and rebellion raise their heads." Unquote. As the native of Aintab was speaking, a representative from Trabzon, Hafez Bey, interrupted him to declare that a relatively small number of Ottoman state officials had participated in the crime, and Artin Efendi demurred. And he said, "There were not just a few of them, there were many more than you think. If I were to list their names one by one, night would fall before I was through." Unquote. The representative from Aleppo then turned to the question of arresting and punishing all those responsible for the massacres without delay, remarking that was an obligation incumbent on the state. He added that it was also the state's task to free abducted Armenian women and orphans and to see it that the Armenians received reparations for the material losses that they had suffered. So at first sight, it may seem that there is nothing untoward in this speech from the victim's point of view. On the contrary, it may even seem audacious given that it was delivered in an assembly still dominated by the idea that the Armenians had been deported for acts of treason toward the Ottoman Empire. Yet, a storm of protest against Artin Efendi broke out in the Armenian press in the weeks following his speech. His remarks came in for ferocious attacks, and he was the object of personal attacks as well, in the form of articles impugning his honor. The central target of the criticism was Artin Efendi's contention that the empire's former government was mainly to blame for the crime, not the Turkish people collectively speaking. Gebenlian, a journalist writing in Haytsayn, an Aleppo newspaper, expressed a diametrically opposed view. And he wrote, "We cannot call a single Turk good or attribute a single Turk's friendly behavior to pro-Armenian feelings. Those who truly tried to help Armenians cannot be called Turks. Those who imagine that any Turk at all harbors human feelings can't be called Armenians." Unquote. Artin Efendi's words had scandalized many Armenians to such an extent that Jumbushian, writing in the Istanbul Armenian newspaper Verchin Lur, objected to the Armenian parliamentarians' speech on the one hand, while observing on the other that the Armenian nation bore no blame for his words. He wrote, "The bodies of people of Boshkezhanian's ilk are Armenian, but their souls are not," unquote. The rage and insults can also be observed in writers whom the deportation had led as far as Derzor and who had only recently returned, such as Yervant Odian or Kevork Mesrop. Thus, Kevork Mesrop writes, quote, "You do not speak on behalf of the Armenians, gentlemen. Speak on the Ittihad's behalf and in its spirit. The Ottoman Parliament is not the tribunal to give a fair hearing to the Armenians' case. You may be sure of that. Have the decency to blush, gentlemen. Do not toy with the misery of your race," unquote. One is left with the impression that Artin Effendi had, with the simple words of his speech, sparked a debate among the Armenians about the Turks' collective responsibility for the genocide or the question of their collective guilt. To forgive or to punish, to remember or to forget, it seems that the debate could have developed further, taking on fundamental significance in the formation of the modern post-war Ottoman society that Artin Effendi himself so ardently championed. Germany, after all, went through the same stage. After the Nazi defeat, a similar debate had sprung up around the central issues of collective guilt, collective Schuld, collective liability, collective Haft, and collective responsibility, collective Verantwortung for Nazi crimes. The comparison, however, stops there. True, in the conditions brought on by defeat and occupation, self-criticism and self-reproach had begun to manifest themselves in Istanbul's Turkish newspapers. The Armenian press and politicians such as Artin Effendi had, with this question, assumed a historical role and were often the stimulation or driving force behind this progressive phenomenon. It is even possible to speculate that Turkish intellectuals' attitude could have evolved to the point of entertaining the idea of collective responsibility, a development that would probably have had a positive influence on the Armenian side, dispelling their extreme suspiciousness and terror and instilling in them a degree of confidence about the prospect of continued coexistence with the Turks. Yet, all this turned out to be no more than a short phase in Turkey's history, lasting barely 1 year. It is well known that thereafter modern Turkey struck an altogether different course, and that this nascent debate would be nipped in the bud. The Armenians' rupture with the Ottoman Turkish world. So such was the main idea informing the rebuttals of Artin Effendi's speech. It would gradually be sanctified by Ottoman Armenian intellectuals in light of the geopolitical transformations that rapidly taking place. The fact is that the genocide and the military defeat of the Ottoman Empire had ensured the ascendancy of the idea that the Armenians no longer had a place in the Ottoman system. New borders were being drawn and new states were coming into existence. The Armenian press and Armenian community and national organizations were also steeped in the spirit of these historical transformations, and the idea that Armenians should seek their future outside the Ottoman state was steadily gaining ground. In this regard, the views of the native of Mush, a nickname probably of Keram Dergarabedian, one of those who took sharp issue with Artin Effendi's speech, were very clear. And he wrote, "Gentlemen, the time for your drivel and the day when it carried weight have now passed. You are mercenary advocates working for the Turks' cause. Argue as much as you like. Our fate has been settled, because the 20th century great legislator of genius, unrivaled champion of liberty, and peerless apostle of peace, Mr. Wilson, is crying from the depths of his heart, the olive branch of reconciliation, liberty in his hand." So we are in the atmosphere of Wilson's self-determination speech. And he continued, "The scriptures church declare, "My temple will be a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of thieves. I have come from the civilized world in order to scatter this band of thieves and give the absolute right to live freely and independently to every people." Unquote. So Artin Effendi was struggling against this new, resolute, commanding current. He had come to resemble an obsolete legacy of the past. He was rowing upstream. His bark was frail, and it was rocking perilously on the wild waves of a sea unfamiliar to him. At the same time, however, the victorious allies lacked the strength and the will to impose a new and different future on the Ottoman Empire, while Turkish society was giving birth to a Kemalist movement that would lead it to victory after victory, but also to denial of the crime. The Armenian elite, for its part, had put its trust in the Allies and their promises of free development, independent of the Turks and separate from Turkey. In these conditions, Artin Effendi was repeating ideas that now seemed untimely, even treacherous. Same period, the parliamentary deputy and native of Aintab gave an interview to the Turkish newspaper Member. Member's reporter asked him for his opinion of the US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the ways and means of implementing them. The rapidly shifting developments then occurring on the political stage had plainly thrown this Ottoman Armenian, a representative of the old school, into a state of severe shock. He had witnessed the annihilation of his people by his own state, and now he was witnessing the slow disintegration of that same state and the dismemberment of the empire. The whole world of the past was crumbling before his eyes. The man was clearly groping in the dark, yet he endeavored to keep faith with his principles. Thus he declared that for him the first priority was to see justice and equality brought about. And he said during this interview, "Let justice be done whether by the hand of a Wilson or a Lloyd George or even that of a Turk. Wilson's principles, the right of the people of self-determination, there's the sticking point, and it's beyond my understanding. That there must be equality surely can't mean that separate governments ought to be established in one and the same country. Muslim and Christians have never been equals in this country. What I seek is equality. My honor, my possessions, my soul must be safe. Let whoever wants to ensure that, as long as the vintage is brought in, the vineyard can belong to anyone it likes." Unquote. So far from Istanbul, in Hama, Dernerses Tavukcan and Krikor Bogharian were likewise moving in step with the times. Surviving human wrecks, a huge multitude of Armenian orphans, Armenian women in Turkish, Arab, and Kurdish families, or working as prostitutes. Obviously, this somber picture could not be transformed overnight. The Allied forces had reached this part of the empire, and the Armenians had been liberated. Nevertheless, the tragedy of many Armenians continued unabated. Characteristic and impressive, nonetheless, is the rapidity and single-mindedness with which the Armenians strove to recover and to organize themselves. We see them mobilizing to this end in every town and village in Bilad al-Sham to which they had been deported in unified groups. Dernerses and Krikor Bogharian were part of this current. In Hama, on 18 October 1918, on Dernerses' initiative, 21 Armenian notables convened for the purpose of discussing the urgent questions of the day. The diarist observes, quote, "This is the first time since we Armenians were exiled to these regions that we have convened a meeting freely and without danger," unquote. The meeting was followed by another, bigger one, in the course of which a 7-member National Assembly was elected. It was to concern itself with the church, orphans, relief for the poor, and relations with the new authorities. Subsequently, from 30 December 1918 on, this newly created body took the name Armenian National Union. Dernerses was elected its president. In the course of these weeks, the orphanage in Hama was also reopened, and measures were taken to ensure that the orphans would be fed, clothed, and given lessons in Armenian. It was also in this period that our two diaries' paths once again crossed. Krikor Bogharian came to Hama. Before that, he was in Salamiya with his family, where he was named secretary of both the newly organized National Union and the orphanage. Although we do not know the details, it is not at all improbable that their nurses played an important part in securing this double appointment. Their nurses and Bogharian's subsequent lives did not differ much more from those led by the rest of this survivor generation. In 1919, like many of the survivors among his townsmen, Krikor Bogharian too returned to Aintab. There, in Aintab, an authority had already been established by the occupying Allied forces. In Aintab, he worked as a teacher in an Armenian orphanage. In 1920, the town's Armenians once again felt that their lives were in danger in view of Allied armies' weakness and the Kemalist movement's successive military triumphs. And in these circumstances, in May 1920, the children and staff of this Armenian orphanage left Aintab and moved to the Lebanese coastal city of Jounieh. Bogharian too was in this group of people who had abandoned their hometown. He continued to teach in the orphanage for a while and then moved to Aleppo, where he was named principal of Aleppo's Aintabi Gertasirats school. He died in Beirut. Their nurses also returned to Aintab in June 1919, where he was named an official representative of the Catholicos and president of the board of overseers of the local Armenian orphanage. Others have destroyed our house. That is easy to do. It remains for us to build it. That, of course, is the hardest, he wrote in his diary on 15 September. In 1920, he became president of the local Armenian National Union, a post he held during the Aintab Armenians movement of armed resistance to the Turkish armies. In 1921, he was forced to abandon his hometown and settle in Aleppo. Here, he founded the Compatriotic Union of Natives of Aintab. Their nurses, the objective of this new union was to provide relief to settlers from Aintab. Their nurses was murdered in Aleppo on 3 July 1934. The crime was motivated by the priest's decision in a familial dispute that he had adjudicated. He had ruled that the child of a divorced Armenian couple should remain in its mother's care. Enraged by the decision, the child's father reacted violently, putting an end to the priest's life. But let us turn back to the period of central interest to us, the first months after the genocide. We have the impression that their nurses and Bogharian had no choice. They followed the new current, which was in its turn heavily dependent on the course charted by the victorious Allied states and the decisions that the Allies made. The British and French military authorities had laid plans to evacuate all the Armenian exiles from Bilad al-Sham and resettle them in their native towns and villages, especially in Cilicia. These plans were indeed carried out, and we find Bogharian and nurses in Aintab again. And this multitude of repatriated survivors were supposed to act as the occupying Allied armies and occupation authorities' main means of exercising leverage in Cilicia and the region just east of it. They did, in fact, play this role. Despite the weakness of the local French forces, Aintab's Armenians organized resistance in the city and succeeded in stopping the Turkish troops' advance. Ultimately, France signed an agreement with the authorities under Mustafa Kemal Pasha's direction and withdrew from Cilicia, and the Armenians joined the retreating French forces. Thus, it is that we find their nurses and Bogharian in Syria and Lebanon. At bottom, the two currents, Artin Efendi's and the one opposed to him, closely resembled each other in their weaknesses and helplessness. Both represented surviving remnants of the fragmented, utterly exhausted Armenian community, but relied on a powerful external force to ensure their future development. Both relied on a powerful external force to ensure their future development. In Artin Efendi's case, for example, this force was the contemporary Ottoman state. He wanted to believe, Artin Efendi, that this time the new regime would adopt another course based on the equality of all citizens without discrimination and on the principle of respect for human rights. The catastrophe had also been a powerful shock for Artin Efendi and those like him. He was, after all, a native of Aintab, who had also lost close family members during the deportation and had tried to help many of his relatives on townsmen. Thus, we can be certain that he too was profoundly aware of the horror of the crime. He had nevertheless placed his bets on Turkish intellectuals and the Turkish elite. He had hoped that they would be won to progressive ideas and universal human values, and that this would guarantee that he and his fellow Armenians could continue to live side by side with Turks. The opposite current was radical and nationalistic. The Ottoman Armenians who supported it were convinced that the rupture with the Armenian-Turkish world was irremediable. For them, the party responsible for conceiving and executing the plan for genocide was Turkish society as a whole, toward which they had now adopted an intolerant attitude. Norgyang, an Armenian newspaper in Istanbul, wrote, "A united Ottoman fatherland, all that must now be regarded as history." And addressing Turkish intellectuals generally, Kevork Mesrop exclaims, Kevork Mesrop, who was deported in Derzor, quote, "You are all Ittihadists. If you are afraid to say so, we state the matter plainly and demonstrate that the Ittihad is the one national Turkish party to which you have given birth, which you have fed and raised, which you have supported and will support in future," unquote. Such Armenians considered all talk of solidarity and coexistence to be inappropriate. Another journalist, his name was Onnik, wrote on this issue, quote, "That fraternal solidarity was ruptured on the day when the Armenians, dripping with sweat, were slaughtered in their fields by their brothers' knives, with their wives and daughters were ravished before their eyes, when the desire to shatter the foundations of their existence made itself felt with a barbaric savagery never before recorded in history," unquote. So the slogan of the day was national reconstruction. It was imperative to find and regroup the fragments of a people that had been massacred and deported, and gathering its thousands of orphans and ensuring that they would enjoy an Armenian education was a crucially important part of this task. Wipe clean or purify are frequently recurring verbs in the Armenian rhetoric of this period, whenever the subject of discussion is the orphans' education and Armenization. The Armenian orphanages were supposed to form Armenians of this kind, tomorrow's Armenians. Bogharian and their nurses hastened to shoulder this task. The nationalistic current sought to make the memory and pain of the catastrophe, together with hatred for the Turks, the principal cement of the nascent process of national reconstruction. In the Armenian schools, established in Syria and Cilicia in particular, and thereafter in Lebanon and Greece, these two elements were transformed into the central means of ideological homogenization. Memory and forgetting. To remember the catastrophe and which side had planned it and carried it out, to keep the memory of the martyrs alive, to forget and outlaw Turkish and various other phenomena, as well as ways of life that bound the Armenians to the Ottoman world. Like every nationalist process, however, this one too was marked by inner contradiction. Manifestly, an effort was underway to create a new Armenian society, the biggest segments of which would be drawn from the Armenians who had been deported to Bilad al-Sham. Their nurses was eminently familiar with them, had witnessed their suffering, and as he himself puts it, their degradation, demoralization, and bestialization. Now it would be necessary for him to work with this same segment of these people, to provide it guidance, to forget the bitterness and anger that he had felt toward it. Obviously, this would not be an easy experience. Der Nerses was anguished, as the entries in his diary also attest. On 24 November 1918, he celebrated Mass before a big crowd in the church in Hama. He wrote, "But I continued to feel the peak of conscience in my heart, as did no doubt everyone else as well. All the people had changed their names. All still bear the stain that stain today. I looked around me during the church service. The priest officiating, the deacon, the members of the choir, and the congregation had all become Muslims for a time in their death of suffering. Unfortunately, feelings of repentance have not yet sprung up in their hearts, and they are not aware that they erred. Most of them think that they had to act as they did and that the Lord does not consider what little they did wrong." Unquote. The newly created situation required that der Nerses and all other surviving Armenians demonstrate a spirit of unity and solidarity. The priest from Aintab, however, found it difficult to forget the recent past and the bitterness associated with it. And he wrote, "The people are eternal sheep. Some find fault with others for converting to Islam, and no one recalls that all have been blackened by the same sin. Some find fault with others for having been swindlers under the old regime, and do not remember that all were guilty of the same vice, only to different degrees." Unquote. Der Nerses felt still greater indignation when some of the Armenians who had converted to Islam during the deportation tried to take leading positions in the reconstructed Armenian people's newly reorganized institutions. He clearly spoke his mind in Hama when he learned that the Catholicos of the Armenian and the Armenian national bodies had sent Father Vahan Guldalian to Aintab with the mission of restoring the diocese and Armenian national institutions. For der Nerses, der Vahan was an apostate, someone who had abjured his faith. It is not unlikely that the diarist from Aintab considered himself to be the person the most deserving of such a post. And he wrote, "O times, O mores, der Vahan, an apostate who abjured his faith, although he had no reason to fear violent treatment, is now outstripping all the others in his eagerness to take control of Aintab's church. Still more surprising, the Catholicos, who is aware of all this, has entrusted his post to him before all others, while the Aintab Union has extended him the first invitation. But there is no reason to be surprised, because our teacher said 2,000 years ago, the world loves its own." Unquote. Time should show that the process of national reconstruction would succeed in expunging the phase in which the deported Armenians collectively converted to Islam from the Armenians' collective memory. Like the whole parenthesis represented by their life in Bilad al-Sham. Subsequently, for decades on end, Armenian memoirists and historians very rarely reflected on this phenomenon or subjected it to serious examination. It is as if description or narration of the catastrophe could not acknowledge the existence of a collective stain of this kind. In fact, in Armenian historiography or Armenian culture in general, the Armenian genocide takes the form of an episode in which an entire people was martyred. The image of the martyr nation has been sanctified. The victims have been subjected to a metamorphosis that has made them objects of admiration and even veneration. In this process of sanitizations, the victims of the crime, both those who were killed and those who survived, have been transformed into paragons of innocence and purity. In a monolithic presentation of this sort, one important facet of the catastrophe is naturally overlooked: the struggle against mass violence by all available means, and the natural human tendency to try to survive at any price. Doubtless many were inclined to see a kind of desecration in the sudden appearance in this picture studded with powerful symbols of the episode of collective Islamization. In their eyes, it could perhaps have tarnished the image of the hallowed martyr and sowed confusion in officialized discourse. The upshot of this situation was that people began collectively to forget the event that occurred under Empire of Evil, the word used by der Nerses, the conversion that led Dernerses to pronounce religious and national anathema on his compatriots. Apostasy and moral degradation were, for him, red lines beyond which lay the greatest of the disasters that could befall a human being. The priest from Aintab witnessed this tragedy and the crossing of the red line. The deported Armenians had, however, been liberated. The conditions of their lives had been transformed, and the group of tens of thousands of survivors had collectively returned to the national community and national church. The doors were open to them, and Dernerses too, despite his abiding bitterness, probably found himself with no choice but to accept them and live and work with them. Yet, the genocide and liberation had given rise to a new dividing line. Evidently, solidarity and coexistence with Turks was now deemed unacceptable. With his speech, Artin Effendi had crossed the new red line, and for that reason had immediately become the target of verbal attacks from Armenian intellectuals that were tantamount to national anathema. Both Bogharian and Dernerses knew this personality, Artin Effendi, who, like them, was from Aintab. Artin Effendi's name is mentioned several times in their diaries. In the Hamas Alamiya environment of the deportees, Artin Effendi's intervention in favor of Aintabtsi's deportees was important. Bogharian attests that what the deportation of the Armenians from Aintab began, Artin Effendi had intervened with the Ottoman authorities and succeeded in winning 10 or so Armenian families, relatives and friends of his, the right to remain in Aleppo rather than being deported somewhere else. Later, when many Aintab natives settled in Salamiya, these Armenian members of parliament intervened again on their behalf. The result was that Sarkis Karadzian, Hrant Sulahian, Dernerses' brother-in-law, the Basmadjian, Ghazarian, and Ashtian families, as well as the families of Haji Rupen Bosh Gezenian, the husband of Krikor Bogharian's maternal aunt, and Hagop Karamanugyan, were given the right to settle in Aleppo. But the post-genocide restructured Armenian historiography was founded on new principles and was to treat Artin Effendi just as mercilessly. Krikor Bogharian would later edit the periodical Armenian Aintab, later renamed New Aintab, and memorialize the activity of a multitude of Armenian notables from Aintab in its pages. He would also write a book entitled Aintabagang, Aintabiana, in which he presented the biographies of more than 150 Armenians from that city. Finally, he was to contribute to the two-volume general history of almost 2,000 pages called Patmuchun Antebi Hayots, History of the Armenians of Aintab, edited by Kevork Sarafyan. Artin Effendi never once appears in any of those texts. There was no longer any place for him in the Armenian collective memory. Thank you.